The carriage wheels ground against the frost-hardened earth of Winterborne's long approach, each revolution bringing Dorian Ravensholt closer to the place that had once been his entire world. The November wind carried the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke, familiar as his own breath, yet strange after so many months away. He pressed his gloved hand against the window, watching the skeletal trees pass like silent sentinels, their bare branches reaching toward a slate-grey sky that promised snow before nightfall. 1 year. 365 days since the moment his brother's blade had found his ribs, since the cold Atlantic had swallowed him whole, since everything he believed about love and loyalty had shattered like glass against stone. The scar beneath his waistcoat pulled tight as he shifted in his seat, a constant reminder that some wounds never truly heal. The physicians in Portugal had called his survival miraculous. Dorian called it something else entirely: rage given flesh, vengeance dressed in survival's clothes. Death had reached for him in those dark waters, but he had refused its embrace, not because he feared the void, but because he could not die while Cedric still drew breath, while his brother still wore the stolen crown of righteousness, while Lady Marian Thornvale still believed herself widowed by tragedy rather than treachery. Marian. Even now her name was a prayer and a curse on his lips. Had she mourned him? Had she moved on? The letters he'd managed to send through intermediaries had gone unanswered, but he'd been careful, cryptic, unable to reveal himself fully until he could return with proof of what Cedric had done. The not knowing had been its own kind of torture during the long months of recovery, the endless nights when fevered dreams had shown him her face turning away, her hand accepting another's, her heart forgetting the promises they'd whispered beneath summer stars. The estate appeared through the mist like something from a ghost story. All grey stone and mullioned windows, the Ravensholt banner hanging limp in the still air. Home. The word tasted bitter. How many times had he and Cedric raced across those lawns as boys, their laughter echoing off the ancient walls? How many evenings had they sat by the library fire, sharing dreams and confidences, brothers bound by blood and something deeper? Or so Dorian had believed. The carriage halted before the main entrance, and Dorian descended without waiting for the footman. His boots struck the gravel with purpose. He had not sent word of his arrival. There would be no prepared speeches, no carefully constructed lies. He wanted to see Cedric's face when his ghost walked through the door. He wanted to watch the colour drain from those familiar features, to see fear replace the false grief his brother had no doubt perfected. The great door swung open before he could reach for it, and there stood Fitzwilliam, the butler who had served the Ravensholt family for 40 years. The old man's face went white as parchment, his hand trembling on the doorknob. "Master Dorian," he breathed, and the title carried the weight of disbelief, of joy, of terrible understanding. "You're alive." "So it would seem, Fitz." Dorian stepped into the familiar entrance hall, his eyes adjusting to the dim interior. Everything was exactly as he remembered. The portraits of long-dead ancestors, the sweeping staircase, the scent of beeswax and old wood. Yet everything was different, poisoned by knowledge. "Where is my brother?" Fitzwilliam's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Finally he managed, "In the study, my lord. But perhaps you should—" Dorian was already moving, his long strides carrying him down the corridor toward the room where his father had once managed the estate's affairs, where Cedric now presumably sat in a chair that had never been meant for him. The door was ajar, and through it drifted the sound of papers rustling, the clink of crystal against crystal. His brother, enjoying an afternoon brandy while wearing the mask of grief. He pushed the door open without knocking. Cedric stood at the window, his back to the room, one hand holding a glass of amber liquid, the other resting against the frame as he gazed out at the gardens. He had always been the smaller of the two brothers, more delicate in build, with their mother's fine features and fair hair where Dorian had inherited their father's darker colouring and broader frame. In childhood, people had called Cedric angelic. Now, Dorian saw only the serpent beneath the beauty. "Fitzwilliam, I said I was not to be disturbed," Cedric said without turning, his voice carrying that particular petulance he'd perfected as a boy. "Whatever it is can wait until—" "Can it, brother?" The glass slipped from Cedric's fingers, shattering against the floor in an explosion of crystal and brandy. He spun around, and Dorian had the satisfaction of seeing every drop of colour flee his face, leaving him pale as a corpse. For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them crackled with everything unsaid, with the weight of betrayal and survival, and the terrible reckoning that had finally arrived. "Dorian," Cedric's voice emerged as barely a whisper. But they said—" The ship was destroyed. There were no survivors. They searched for weeks. "No survivors but you mean?" Dorian stepped further into the room, watching his brother with the cold calculation of a predator sizing up prey. Convenient that. The heroic younger brother, the sole witness to his beloved elder's tragic death. "Tell me, Cedric, how many times did you rehearse that performance? How long did you practice the tears?" Cedric's hand went to his throat, a tell Dorian remembered from childhood, the gesture he made when caught in a lie. "I don't understand what you're implying. I nearly died trying to save you. If you're suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating facts." Dorian pulled off his gloves slowly, deliberately, and began unfastening his waistcoat. "Would you like to see the scar your blade left? The physician said another inch to the left, and you would have pierced my heart. You were always sloppy with a knife, even as a boy." The room seemed to contract around them. Cedric's eyes darted to the door, calculating escape routes, and Dorian had to suppress the urge to laugh at the transparency of it. Did his brother truly think he could run from this? That there was anywhere in England, in all the world, where Dorian wouldn't find him? "I was delirious," Cedric stammered, backing toward the desk. "The trauma, the shock of the attack. If I struck out, it was in confusion, thinking you were one of the pirates. Surely you can't believe I would intentionally—" "Stop." The single word cracked like a whip. "I've had a year to replay that night in my mind. A year of fever dreams where I heard your voice giving the orders, where I saw your face as you watched me go over the rail. A year to piece together every lie you ever told, every false smile, every moment of manufactured devotion. I know what you did, Cedric. More importantly, I know why." Something shifted in Cedric's expression then, a crack in the facade of shock and innocence. For just an instant, Dorian glimpsed the truth beneath, the jealousy, the resentment, the hatred that had festered in his brother's heart like a cancer. Then it was gone, replaced by desperation. "Prove it," Cedric said, and there was something almost like courage in his voice. "You have no witnesses, no evidence, just the ravings of a man who suffered a terrible head wound and spent months in delirium. Who do you think the courts will believe? The grieving brother who watched helplessly as pirates murdered his beloved elder, or the traumatized survivor who's concocted a fantasy to make sense of random tragedy?" Dorian smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "You're right, I have no legal proof, not yet, but I have time and I have resources you can't imagine. The men who pulled me from the water, the sailors who heard things they shouldn't have, the financial records that will show the bribes you paid. I'll find it all, Cedric. I'll unravel every thread of your betrayal until the whole world sees you for what you are." "And while you're playing detective," Cedric said, recovering some of his composure, "what of Lady Marian? Have you considered what this will do to her? She's spent a year mourning you, believing you dead. Now you return with wild accusations against your own brother, threatening to tear apart the very fabric of this family. Is that the man she fell in love with? The man who would destroy everything for revenge?" The mention of Marian's name was a blade between his ribs, more effective than the physical one Cedric had wielded. Dorian's jaw tightened. "Don't speak of her." "Why not? She's all that matters to you, isn't she? She always has been." Cedric's voice took on a bitter edge. "You never understood, did you? What it was like to be the younger son, the spare, the one who would inherit nothing while you got everything. Title, lands, respect. And her. Especially her. Beautiful, perfect Marian Thornevale, who never even glanced at me because she was so besotted with the glorious Dorian Ravensholt. So you tried to kill me." The words hung in the air like smoke. "Because you were jealous of my betrothal." "I tried to become you." Cedric laughed, a hollow sound without humor. "But you survived, you stubborn bastard. You always were too damn proud to die quietly." The confession settled between them like a physical thing. Dorian had expected many reactions, denial, deflection, violence even, but not this bitter honesty. It was as if Cedric, confronted with the impossibility of his situation, had simply given up the pretense. "What happens now?" Cedric asked quietly. "Now?" Dorian rebuttoned his waistcoat with careful precision. "Now I visit Lady Marian, I tell her I'm alive, that I've returned. And then, brother dear, I set about reclaiming everything you tried to steal. She won't believe you about me. She's kind-hearted, she'll think you're ill, traumatized. She'll beg you to forgive and forget, to move forward as a family. Perhaps..." Dorian moved toward the door. "Or perhaps she's stronger than you ever gave her credit for." "Stronger than I gave her credit for. We'll see." He paused in the doorway, looking back at the brother who had become a stranger. "You should know, Cedric, that the only reason you're still breathing is because I need you alive. I need you to stand trial, to face judgment, to have the world see what lurks beneath that angelic face. But test me, threaten her, threaten anyone I care about, and I'll forget about justice and settle for something far more permanent." He left Cedric standing in the ruins of his shattered brandy glass, the broken crystal glinting like scattered stars on the dark wood floor. The ride to Thornavale Manor took less than an hour, but it felt like crossing an ocean. The Thornavale estate neighboured Winterborne, as their families had been allies for generations. Dorian had grown up running through these woods, had learned to ride on these paths, had fallen in love in the rose garden that Lady Marian's mother had planted the year she was born. The manor appeared through the trees, honey-coloured stone glowing in the fading afternoon light. Dorian's hands trembled as he gripped the reins, the first sign of weakness he'd allowed himself since returning to England. How many times had he imagined this moment during those long months of recovery? How many versions of this conversation had he rehearsed, trying to find the right words to explain where he'd been, what had happened, why he hadn't come back sooner? But there were no right words for resurrection. A groom took his horse, and the young man's eyes went wide with recognition and confusion. Word would spread through the servants' quarters within minutes. Lord Dorian Ravensholt, returned from the dead. By nightfall, all of society would be buzzing with speculation. Let them talk. He cared for only one person's reaction. The butler, an ancient man named Graves, opened the door and promptly sat down hard on the entrance hall bench, pressing a hand to his heart. "Lord Ravensholt," he wheezed. "Sweet merciful heavens. Is she here, Graves? Is Lady Marian at home?" "The conservatory, my lord. She spends most afternoons there now. Since you..." He couldn't finish the sentence. Dorian knew the way. The conservatory had been Marian's sanctuary since childhood, a glass-walled paradise filled with exotic plants her father had collected from across the empire. They had shared their first kiss there, hidden among the ferns and orchids, their hearts racing with the thrill of young love. The glass door stood ajar, and he could hear her before he saw her, the soft, wordless melody she hummed when she was lost in thought. He pushed the door open slowly, and there she was, silhouetted against the windows, her dark hair caught up in a simple knot, tendrils escaping to frame her face. She wore black still, mourning clothes that made her pale skin seem luminous. She was arranging flowers in a vase, her movements graceful and economical, and for a moment Dorian could only stand and watch her, drinking in the sight of her like a man dying of thirst. She must have sensed his presence because she turned, the smile on her lips fading as she registered his presence. The vase slipped from her fingers, shattering against the stone floor. Water and roses spread across the ground between them. "Marian," he said, and his voice cracked on her name. She swayed and he moved without thinking, crossing the space between them in 3 long strides, catching her before she could fall. She was real and warm in his arms, smelling of roses and the lavender water she'd always favored. For a heartbeat she was soft against him, and then she was pushing away, stumbling backward, her hands trembling as they rose to her mouth. "No," she whispered. "No, you're not real. You're not... This is a trick, a cruel trick, and I don't... I'm real, Marian. I'm here. I'm alive. They said you drowned. Cedric said... He told us there was no hope, that you went down with the ship, that he'd searched for days and found nothing. They held a memorial service. I wore black. I mourned you." Her voice rose with each sentence, hysteria edging in. "I mourned you for a year." "I know. God, Marian, I know, and I'm sorry. I wanted to come back sooner, but I couldn't. Not until I was strong enough to—" "Strong enough?" She laughed, and it was a terrible sound. "You were strong enough to send word, weren't you? To let me know you lived. Do you have any idea what this year has been like? What it's been like to wake every morning and remember all over again that you were gone? To see Cedric wearing your father's signet ring, sitting in your chair managing your estate? To watch the world move on as if you had never existed?" The pain in her voice was a knife twisting in his gut. "I sent letters, 3 of them through different channels. They must have been intercepted or never existed," she said bitterly. "Perhaps this is all a fever dream. Perhaps I'm finally going mad from grief." He took a step toward her, hands outstretched. "Touch me. Look at me. I'm no ghost, no hallucination. I'm Dorian, you're Dorian, and I've come back for you." She did touch him then, her fingers trembling as they traced the line of his jaw, the scar that ran from his temple into his hairline, a souvenir from the night of the betrayal. Her touch was feather-light, as if she feared he might dissolve beneath her fingers. "How?" she whispered. "How did you survive?" The short version? A Portuguese fishing vessel found me more dead than alive, clinging to debris 2 days after the attack. They nursed me through fever and infection in a coastal village where no one knew my name. By the time I was conscious enough to tell them who I was, months had passed. I was weak, Marian. Too weak to travel, too weak to do anything but lie in bed and dream of coming home to you. And the long version? Her hand dropped away, and he mourned the loss of contact. The long version involves my brother's treachery, his plot to murder me and take everything that was mine. It involves the men he hired, the lies he told, the betrayal that nearly destroyed me in ways the Atlantic never could. He watched her face as understanding dawned, as the implications of his words settled over her like a dark veil. She shook her head slowly, backing away from him. "No. No, Cedric wouldn't. He was devastated by your death. He's been managing the estate with dedication. He's been kind to me and my family. He's been playing a role," Dorian finished. "And he's played it well. I'll grant him that. But it's a lie, Marian. All of it. My brother wanted me dead, so he could inherit the dukedom, so he could have everything that was meant to be mine. Including me?" The words were barely audible. "Especially you." She pressed her hands to her face, and he could see her mind working, trying to reconcile what she knew of Cedric. Kind, gentle Cedric, who had supported her through her grief, with the monster Dorian was describing. The cognitive dissonance was written plainly in her expression. "I can't believe this," she said finally. "I won't. You've been through a terrible trauma, Dorian. The attack, the near drowning, the long recovery. Perhaps your memories are confused, perhaps—" "My memories are crystal clear," he said, hearing the hardness creep into his voice. "I remember the feel of his knife between my ribs. I remember his men throwing me overboard. I remember his face as he watched me sink. Then why would he tell everyone you were dead if he wasn't certain? Why search for days? Why maintain the estate with such care? Why comfort me through my grief?" Her voice broke on the last word. "None of it makes sense if what you're saying is true. It makes perfect sense if you understand that Cedric is a better actor than either of us ever realized. He needed to play the grieving brother, the heroic survivor, the reluctant heir. He needed everyone's sympathy and trust, so that when I didn't return, no one would question his version of events." Marian wrapped her arms around herself, and Dorian ached to hold her, to comfort her. But he could see the wall she'd erected between them, a wall built of shock and confusion, and the terrible possibility that everything she'd believed for the past year might be a lie. "I need time," she said quietly. "I need to think, to understand. This is all too much, too fast. An hour ago you were dead. Now you're alive and accusing your brother of attempted murder. I don't know what to believe." "Believe me," he said desperately. "Believe us. Believe what we had, what we promised each other. What we had was a year ago. We're different people now. I'm different, you're different. You've been through something terrible and She stopped, swallowing hard. I've spent 12 months learning to live without you, learning to accept that you were gone. And now you're back, and I should be overjoyed, but instead I'm confused and frightened, and I don't know what's real anymore." The words were like physical blows. He'd imagined their reunion so many times, had pictured her falling into his arms, tears of joy, promises renewed. He hadn't prepared for this, for her doubt, her hesitation, the distance in her eyes. "I'm real," he said, hearing the rawness in his own voice. "What we had was real. And I know you need time, but Marian, please don't pull away from me, not now, not when I've finally made it back to you." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw the war playing out in her expression. Love and doubt, joy and fear, the desperate desire to believe warring with the protective instinct to guard her heart. "I won't make any promises," she said finally. "I can't. But I won't turn you away either. Give me time to reconcile all of this, to speak with Cedric, to understand what really happened. Can you do that?" It wasn't what he wanted. He wanted her to choose him immediately, completely, without reservation. But he could see the steel in her spine, the strength that had always drawn him to her. She wouldn't be rushed or bullied into belief. She needed to find her own truth. "I can give you time," he said, though it cost him dearly. "But be careful around Cedric. Whatever you think you know about him, whatever kindness he's shown you this past year, remember that he's capable of murder. Don't let yourself be alone with him. Don't trust him with anything that matters." "He's your brother," she said softly. "He's been good to my family. I can't believe he's the monster you're describing. He's my brother, and that's precisely why I know what he's capable of. I grew up with him. I saw the jealousy, the resentment, the way he looked at me when he thought no one was watching. I just never believed he'd act on it." Marian moved toward the door, and Dorian forced himself not to reach for her, not to pull her back. "I'll send word," she said, "when I'm ready to talk again. But Dorian, please, get some rest, see a physician. Make sure you're truly recovered, both physically and mentally. If what you're saying is true, you'll need all your strength for what comes next." She left him standing among the broken glass and scattered roses, the scent of flowers mixing with the acrid tang of fear and frustration. He'd survived betrayal, and the ocean's fury had clawed his way back from the edge of death itself. And yet nothing had prepared him for the possibility that he might lose her, not to death or distance, but to doubt. The days that followed were a special kind of torment. Dorian returned to Winterbornne, but he couldn't stay under the same roof as Cedric, couldn't bear to see his brother's face across the breakfast table or pass him in the corridors. Instead, he took up residence in the hunting lodge on the far edge of the estate, a small but comfortable building where he could think clearly without the constant reminder of his brother's presence. He spent his days gathering evidence. The men who had pulled him from the water, Portuguese fishermen whose testimonies he carefully documented and had translated, the financial records showing unusual expenditures in the weeks before the attack, letters his brother had sent to various unsavory contacts, carefully worded but damning in their implications. It was slow work, painstaking and frustrating, but each piece of evidence was another nail in Cedric's eventual coffin. Nights were harder. In the darkness, he couldn't stop thinking about Marian, wondering if she was questioning Cedric, if she was beginning to see through the mask. He replayed their conversation in the conservatory endlessly, analyzing every word, every gesture, every flicker of emotion in her face. Had he pushed too hard? Should he have been gentler, more patient? Or should he have been more forceful, more insistent that she believe him immediately? The not knowing was driving him mad. A week after his return, Fitzwilliam appeared at the lodge with a letter. The old butler's face was carefully neutral as he handed over the sealed envelope, but his eyes held sympathy. "Lady Marian's man delivered this an hour ago, my lord." Dorian's hands shook as he broke the seal. The letter was short, her handwriting as elegant as always, but with a slight tremor in some of the strokes that betrayed her emotional state. "Dorian, I've spent this week in prayer and contemplation, trying to reconcile what you've told me with what I've observed this past year. I've also spoken with Cedric, though I didn't reveal that you suspect him of wrongdoing. His shock at your survival seemed genuine. His joy at your return appeared heartfelt. I don't know what to believe. My heart wants to trust you completely, but my mind demands evidence. You've asked me to condemn a man who has shown me nothing but kindness, based on accusations that rest solely on your word. I'm not refusing to believe you. I'm simply saying I need more than accusations. Show me proof, Dorian. Help me understand. And perhaps in the process we can find our way back to each other. Meet me tomorrow at sunset in the rose garden. Come alone. M. He read the letter 3 times, searching for hidden meaning in every word. It wasn't a rejection, but it wasn't acceptance either. She was asking him to prove his claims, to give her something concrete she could hold on to. It was fair, rational even, but it filled him with dread because he didn't yet have the kind of evidence that would satisfy a court of law or a woman desperate to believe the best of people. Still, she was willing to meet him, to give him a chance. That had to mean something. The next evening found him in the Thornavale rose garden as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The roses were past their peak season, many of the blooms withered or fallen, but there was still beauty in the garden, a melancholy end-of-year beauty that matched his mood. Marian appeared like an apparition, wrapped in a dark cloak against the evening chill. She'd left off her mourning black, he noticed, and wore instead a dress of deep burgundy that made her skin glow. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, the way she'd worn it when they were courting, and the world seemed full of possibility. "You came," he said, and hated how uncertain he sounded. "I said I would." She stopped a few feet away, maintaining distance between them. "I've been thinking about what you said, about Cedric, about what happened, about everything. And I need you to understand something, Dorian. When they told me you were dead, something inside me died too. I've spent a year learning to live with that emptiness, learning to function without you. It wasn't easy, but I managed. I found a new equilibrium, however painful." She paused, her eyes searching his face. "Now you're back, and that equilibrium is shattered. I'm relieved, overjoyed even, but I'm also terrified. Terrified of losing you again. Terrified of losing myself again. Terrified of what the truth might reveal." "I'm not going anywhere," he said fiercely. "I survived hell to come back to you. I'm not leaving, not ever again." "You can't promise that. None of us can control fate." She moved closer, and he caught the scent of her perfume, achingly familiar. "But I've decided something. I've decided that whatever happened between you and Cedric, whatever the truth is, I won't let it destroy us. If he truly tried to kill you, the truth will out. If your memories are confused by trauma, we'll work through it together. But I won't choose between you and your brother based on accusations and suspicions. I'll wait for proof. And while you wait, he walks free. He lives in my house, manages my estate, presents himself as the rightful heir. He's not claiming the dukedom, Dorian. He's made no moves to petition the courts for official recognition. He's simply been maintaining things in your absence. That's not the behavior of a man who believes he's gotten away with murder. It's the behavior of a man who's playing a long game." Dorian ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "He's waiting for enough time to pass, for the story of my death to become firmly established. Then he'll make his move. Perhaps. Or perhaps you're wrong about him." She held up a hand when he started to protest. "I'm not saying you are. I'm saying it's possible. I need you to admit that possibility, to acknowledge that your trauma might have colored your perceptions. It was the reasonable position, the rational stance, and he wanted to shake her for it. He wanted her to believe him blindly, to take his word as gospel, to side with him without hesitation. But that wasn't who Marian was. She'd never been the type to accept anything without question, to let emotion override logic. It was one of the things he loved about her, even as it frustrated him now. "I'll admit it's theoretically possible," he said carefully. "But Marian, I know what happened. I know what I saw, what I felt. This isn't confusion or trauma or fantasy. This is the truth, as clear and sharp as the scar on my side." "Then help me see it," she said softly. "Show me the evidence you're gathering. Let me examine it with my own eyes, draw my own conclusions. Don't ask me to believe on faith alone." It was a reasonable request, but it made him acutely aware of how little concrete evidence he actually had. Testimonies from Portuguese fishermen, who spoke no English and had no standing in British courts. Financial records that were suggestive but not definitive. Letters that could be interpreted multiple ways. Nothing that would stand up under serious scrutiny. Nothing that would convince someone determined to think the best of Cedric. "The evidence isn't complete yet," he admitted, "but it's building. Give me another week, maybe 2, and I'll have enough to make an ironclad case." "A week or 2, she nodded slowly. "I can wait that long. In the meantime, let's try to remember who we were to each other. Let's see if we can find our way back to what we had." "And your parents? What do they think of all this?" A shadow crossed her face. "They're confused, as you might imagine. Overjoyed that you're alive, concerned about what your return means for the family, worried about the accusations you're making. My father wants to believe you, but he's known Cedric since birth. He can't reconcile the boy he watched grow up with the villain you're describing." "The best villains are the ones we never suspect," Dorian said bitterly. Perhaps the real villain is whoever put these ideas in your head while you were injured and vulnerable. Have you considered that? That someone might have manipulated you, used your trauma to turn you against your own brother? He hadn't considered it, mostly because he knew with bone-deep certainty that his memories were accurate. But he could see how it might look to an outsider. A man returns from near death with a fantastic story of betrayal, accusing his devoted brother of attempted murder. It did sound like the ravings of a damaged mind. "No one manipulated me," he said firmly. "I know what Cedric did, but I understand why you're skeptical. Just promise me you'll look at the evidence when I present it. Promise me you'll keep an open mind." "I promise." She reached out then, her fingers brushing against his hand. The touch was electric, sending sensation shooting up his arm. "I've missed you," she whispered. "Even now, with all this confusion and fear, I've missed you so much." He couldn't help himself. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, burying his face in her hair. She was warm and real and alive, and for a moment, nothing else mattered. Not Cedric's betrayal, not the need for evidence, not the complicated mess his return had created. There was only this, her heartbeat against his chest, her breath warm on his neck, her hands clutching at his coat as if she'd never let go. "I love you," he murmured against her hair. "I never stopped, not for a single moment. Every day I spent recovering, every night I lay awake in that foreign land, you were all I could think about. You were the reason I fought to survive." "Don't say things like that," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "Don't make promises we might not be able to keep." "It's not a promise, it's a fact." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. "Whatever happens with Cedric, whatever the truth turns out to be, this is real. We are real." She nodded, tears glistening on her lashes. "I want to believe that. I want to believe in us again. But you have to give me time to sort through everything, to understand what's true and what's confused." "Time," he repeated, tasting the word like ash. "How much time?" "As much as it takes." She stepped back, breaking the embrace. "I should go. My father will worry if I'm out after dark." He watched her leave, her figure growing smaller as she walked back toward the manor house. The sunset painted the sky in shades of crimson and gold, beautiful and terrible, and he felt the weight of everything he'd lost and might never fully regain settling over him like a shroud. The following days were a careful dance of strategy and subterfuge. Dorian continued his investigation, sending discreet inquiries to the shipping company that had operated the vessel on which the attack occurred. He hired investigators to track down the men Cedric had hired, offering rewards for information. He pored over his brother's correspondence, looking for patterns, for proof, for anything that would validate his accusations. Meanwhile, Cedric played his own game. He appeared at social functions looking appropriately shocked and delighted by his brother's return. He told anyone who would listen how he'd searched for Dorian for weeks after the attack, how he'd nearly died himself, trying to save his beloved brother. He wept convincingly when describing his grief, his joy at the miracle of Dorian's survival. And through it all he watched Dorian with eyes that held a warning, a reminder that he too was gathering his forces, preparing his defenses. They met formally at Winterbornne for the reading of estate business, with the family solicitor present. The atmosphere was glacial, every word carefully chosen, every gesture calculated. Cedric presented his accounting of the past year's management with meticulous detail, showing how he'd maintained the estate, increased profits, handled disputes. On paper, he'd been an exemplary steward. "Your brother has done well," the solicitor said, obvious admiration in his voice. "Many men would have let things slide during such a difficult time, but Lord Cedric has been diligent and responsible." "How commendable," Dorian said dryly. Such dedication to an inheritance he thought he'd claimed permanently. The solicitor looked confused, but Cedric's expression remained neutral. "I never considered it my inheritance, brother. I was merely keeping things in order until your return, which I always hoped for despite the odds." The lie was delivered with such sincerity that even Dorian felt a moment of doubt. Could he be wrong? Could his brother truly be innocent, and his memories nothing more than trauma-induced delusions? But then he remembered the feel of the blade, the cold calculation in Cedric's eyes, and the doubt evaporated. "Of course," Dorian said smoothly. "How foolish of me to suggest otherwise." After the solicitor departed, the brothers faced each other across the desk. Cedric spoke first, his voice low and urgent. "What do you want, Dorian? What will it take for you to let this go? Justice, truth, your confession. A confession to a crime I didn't commit?" Cedric shook his head. "You're asking the impossible." "Am I? Or am I simply asking you to be honest for once in your miserable life?" "I've been nothing but honest." Cedric's composure cracked slightly. "You're the one spinning fantasies, turning a tragedy into a conspiracy. I loved you, Dorian. I was devastated when I thought you died. And now you've returned, and instead of gratitude for how I've maintained your legacy, you accuse me of attempted murder. It's madness. It's the truth. It's your truth, perhaps, but not the truth." Cedric stood, moving toward the window. "I won't fight you on this. I won't engage in some public battle that will destroy both our reputations and tear apart everything our family has built. But neither will I confess to something I didn't do. So we're at an impasse." "Not an impasse. A war. And I will win it." Cedric turned back, and for just a moment the mask slipped. Dorian saw the hatred there, raw and honest and utterly without remorse. "You already lost, brother. You lost the moment you went over that rail. Everything that's happened since is just your refusal to accept defeat. We'll see about that." The confrontation left Dorian feeling hollowed out and furious. He needed a breakthrough, something definitive that would prove Cedric's guilt beyond any doubt. And he needed it soon, before his brother could consolidate his position further, before the whispers of Dorian's instability became accepted truth. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of his investigators returned from the coast with information about a sailor who'd served on the ship where the attack occurred. The man had been injured in the fighting and left behind when the crew dispersed, and he'd spent the past year in a Portuguese harbour town, drinking away his memories. Dorian rode to Portsmouth, where the man was currently lodging, a decrepit inn near the docks that reeked of fish and desperation. The sailor, a grizzled man named Hawkins, regarded him with rheumy eyes. "You're the one they tried to kill," Hawkins said without preamble. "I remember your face. You fought like a devil before they threw you over." "Tell me what you know," Dorian demanded, his heart racing. "Tell me everything." What emerged over the next hour was exactly what Dorian had suspected but needed confirmed. Cedric had hired a group of mercenaries, paying them to stage an attack on the ship and ensure Dorian didn't survive. Hawkins had been recruited as backup, paid handsomely to keep quiet and disappear afterward. He'd taken the money but regretted it every day since. "It wasn't right," the old sailor muttered. "Killing a man for his title, his inheritance. But I needed the coin, and I told myself it was none of my business what the quality did to each other. You'll testify to this, in court, before magistrates." Hawkins hesitated, fear flickering in his eyes. "Your brother will kill me. He's got reach, that one, money and connections." "I have more of both," Dorian said flatly. "Testify, and I'll ensure your protection. I'll pay you enough to disappear to the colonies if you wish. Start a new life where Cedric can never find you." "But I need your testimony." The sailor studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'll do it. But I want the money first, and I want to be on a ship to the Americas before any trial begins. Done. Dorian left the inn with testimony secured and a written statement signed and witnessed. It wasn't perfect, a drunken sailor's word against a nobleman's, but combined with the other evidence he'd gathered, it might be enough. At the very least, it was enough to cast serious doubt on Cedric's version of events. He went immediately to Thornvale Manor, requesting an audience with Lord Thornvale and Marian together. He found them in the drawing room, and he laid out everything he'd discovered, the financial records, the letters, and now Hawkins' testimony. Lord Thornvale listened in grave silence, his expression growing darker with each revelation. Marian sat beside her father, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "This is damning evidence," Lord Thornvale said finally. "If true, Cedric has committed a grievous crime. But you understand what this means, Dorian? You're accusing a peer of attempted murder. The scandal will be enormous, the social repercussions severe. Are you certain you want to proceed?" "I don't want any of this," Dorian said quietly. "I want my brother to be the man I thought he was. I want the past year to be a nightmare I can wake from. But I can't change reality, and I won't let him get away with what he did." "And if the courts don't believe you?" Marian spoke for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. "If they side with Cedric, then I'll have done everything I could to pursue justice, but I believe the evidence will speak for itself." "The evidence speaks of something," Lord Thornvale said carefully. "Whether it speaks loudly enough to overcome Cedric's reputation and standing remains to be seen. But I'll support you, Dorian. If you're willing to pursue this formally, I'll stand beside you." Dorian looked at Marian, searching her face for some sign of what she was thinking, feeling. She met his gaze steadily, and he saw something shift in her expression, a hardening, a resolution. "I believe you," she said quietly. "I didn't want to. I tried to find reasons to doubt, but I believe you. And I'm so sorry for not believing immediately, for making you prove yourself to me when you'd already been through so much." The relief that flooded through him was overwhelming. He crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "You have nothing to apologize for. You were being rational, careful. That's who you are, and I love you for it." "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we bring formal charges. We take this to the magistrate, present the evidence, and let justice take its course." "Cedric won't go quietly," Lord Thornvale warned. "He'll fight, and he'll fight dirty. He has friends in high places, people who will support him out of loyalty or self-interest. This will be brutal." "I know, but it has to be done." The formal complaint was filed 3 days later. The magistrate, an elderly man named Sir Reginald Blackwood, received Dorian in his chambers with a mixture of sympathy and skepticism. The evidence was presented. Hawkins was brought in to give his testimony. And through it all, Sir Reginald listened with the careful attention of a man who understood the gravity of the accusations. "This is a serious matter," he said when Dorian had finished. "Accusations of attempted fratricide among the nobility. If proven, it could result in hanging. If disproven, it could destroy your credibility and reputation. Are you absolutely certain you wish to proceed?" "I am." "Very well. I'll issue a warrant for Lord Cedric's arrest and hold a preliminary hearing to determine if there's sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. Be prepared for this to get ugly, Lord Ravensholt. Your brother will not go down without a fight." The arrest came the next morning. Dorian wasn't present, he couldn't bear to watch, but Fitzwilliam brought him the details. Cedric had been at breakfast when the magistrate's men arrived. He'd protested his innocence loudly, dramatically, calling the charges absurd and claiming his brother was suffering from delusions brought on by his ordeal. "He's demanding to see you," Fitzwilliam said. "Says he has a right to confront his accuser. Let him demand, I'll see him at the hearing." But Cedric found another way to reach him. That evening, a letter arrived, sealed with the Ravensholt family crest. Dorian opened it with steady hands, though his pulse raced. "Brother, you've won. You've turned everyone against me, convinced them I'm capable of the unthinkable. But winning this battle will cost you everything. The scandal will destroy our family name, ruin Marian's reputation by association, turn you into a pariah. Is that really what you want? I'm prepared to offer you a compromise. Drop the charges. Let me leave England quietly, never to return. You can have your title, your estate, your precious Marion. I'll disappear, and we can both move forward with our lives. No trial, no scandal, no public airing of family shame. Think carefully, Dorian. Justice may satisfy your pride, but it won't bring you happiness. Sometimes mercy is the wiser path. Your brother, Cedric Dorian, read the letter twice, then held it to the candle flame, watching it burn. Cedric thought he could negotiate his way out of consequences, could trade disappearance for freedom. But he was wrong. This wasn't about revenge or pride, or even justice in the abstract. It was about establishing the truth, about ensuring that Cedric couldn't simply slip away and start again somewhere else, potentially harming others. The preliminary hearing was set for a week hence, to be held at the county courthouse. The days leading up to it were a whirlwind of preparation. Dorian met with solicitors, reviewed testimony, prepared his own statement. The legal experts were cautiously optimistic. The evidence was compelling, though circumstantial. Everything would depend on how convincingly the witnesses could present their accounts, and whether Cedric could produce a credible alternative explanation. The morning of the hearing dawned cold and grey, with a bitter wind that cut through even the warmest coat. The courthouse was packed with spectators, nobility and commoners alike, drawn by the spectacle of two brothers locked in mortal legal combat. Dorian arrived with Lord Thornvale and Marion, the three of them presenting a united front. Cedric was already present, flanked by his own solicitors. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of the accusations, though his eyes burned with defiance when they met Dorian's across the courtroom. Sir Reginald called the hearing to order, and the testimony began. Hawkins was first, his sailor's rough manner at odds with the formal setting, but his account was clear and detailed. He described the meeting where Cedric had hired him, the payment received, the attack itself. Under cross-examination, Cedric's lawyers tried to paint him as a drunk and a liar, a man who would say anything for money, but Hawkins held firm. Next came the financial evidence, the unexplained payments, the correspondence with known criminals, the pattern of expenditures that aligned perfectly with the timeline of the attack. Cedric's lawyers argued coincidence, suggesting the payments were for legitimate but private purposes that Lord Cedric was embarrassed to reveal publicly. Finally, Dorian himself took the stand. He recounted the attack in excruciating detail, the feeling of the blade, the sound of his brother's voice giving orders, the cold shock of the water closing over his head. He spoke of his recovery, his return, his confrontation with Cedric. Throughout his testimony he kept his voice steady, his manner calm, despite the storm of emotion raging inside. Cedric's lawyers attacked his credibility viciously. They brought medical experts who testified about the effects of head trauma, suggesting Dorian's memories could be false or distorted. They questioned why he hadn't come forward immediately upon returning to England if he was so certain of his brother's guilt. They painted a picture of a man so traumatized by his experience that he'd constructed an elaborate fantasy to make sense of random tragedy. Then, Cedric himself testified. He was magnetic on the stand, his anguish seeming genuine, his protestations of innocence passionate. He spoke of his love for his brother, his devastation at Dorian's presumed death, his joy at his return. He admitted to making the payments Dorian's lawyers had highlighted, but claimed they were for a mistress he'd been supporting, a married woman whose identity he was honor-bound to protect. He explained away every piece of evidence with plausible alternative explanations, and through it all, he maintained his innocence with unwavering conviction. By the time both sides had finished presenting their cases, the courtroom was buzzing with speculation. Some were clearly convinced of Cedric's guilt, others believed in his innocence, and many remained uncertain, swayed by the passion and apparent sincerity of both brothers. Sir Reginald retired to consider the evidence, leaving everyone to wait in tense silence. Minutes stretched into hours. Marion sat beside Dorian, her hand in his, offering silent support. Lord Thornvale looked grim, clearly understanding the implications regardless of the outcome. Finally, Sir Reginald returned. The courtroom fell silent as he took his seat, his expression grave. "This is among the most difficult cases I've encountered in 30 years on the bench," he began. Two brothers, both credible, both passionate in their testimonies, presenting fundamentally incompatible versions of events. The evidence is substantial, but largely circumstantial. The testimony is compelling, but open to interpretation. Dorian's heart sank. He could hear the but coming, could sense the hesitation. "However," Sir Reginald continued, "I am not required to determine guilt beyond all doubt at this preliminary stage. I must simply determine whether there is sufficient evidence to proceed to trial, and whether a reasonable jury could find the accused guilty based on the evidence presented." He paused, looking directly at Cedric. "Lord Cedric Ravensholt, I find there is sufficient evidence to bind you over for trial on charges of attempted murder. You will remain in custody pending trial, with bail set at £10,000. The courtroom erupted. Cedric's face went white, then red with fury. His lawyers immediately began calling for appeal, for reconsideration. But Sir Reginald's gavel came down hard, silencing the chaos. "Order! I'll have order in this courtroom." He turned to Dorian. "Lord Ravensholt, you understand that this is merely the beginning? That a full trial will be far more rigorous, far more public, and far more difficult than this preliminary hearing?" "I understand, Your Honour." "And you're prepared to see this through to whatever end it reaches?" "I am." "Then God help you both." The trial was set for 6 weeks hence, giving both sides time to prepare. Cedric posted bail, £10,000 produced with suspicious speed, suggesting he had resources Dorian hadn't been aware of. He returned to Winterborne under house arrest, confined to the estate until the trial began. The weeks that followed were a strange interlude of preparation and anticipation. Dorian spent long hours with his legal team, refining strategy, tracking down additional witnesses, building the strongest case possible. Marian was by his side throughout, her initial doubts transformed into fierce loyalty, now that she understood the truth of what had happened. They grew close again during those weeks, rediscovering the connection that had first drawn them together. But it was different now, tempered by trauma, tested by doubt, strengthened by surviving those trials. They took long walks through the winter gardens, talking about everything and nothing, rebuilding trust one conversation at a time. One evening, as snow began to fall soft and silent, Marian turned to him with sudden intensity. "Promise me something," she said. "Promise me that no matter what happens at the trial, you won't let this consume you, that you'll find a way to move forward, to live a full life, even if the verdict isn't what you hope for." "I can't lose," he said. "I can't let him get away with it. But if you do, if the jury believes him instead of you, what then, Dorian? Will you let that destroy what we've rebuilt?" He wanted to promise her what she asked, but honesty demanded truth. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't know how I'll react if justice fails, but I know I love you, and I know I want a future with you, and I'll do everything in my power not to let Cedric take that from us too. That's all I can ask." She kissed him then, soft and sweet, a promise and a prayer. The trial began on a Monday in December, the courthouse packed even more densely than it had been for the preliminary hearing. Every seat was filled, and people stood 3 deep along the walls, craning for a glimpse of the two brothers, whose conflict had become the scandal of the season. The prosecution laid out their case methodically, building layer upon layer of evidence. Hawkins testified again, his account unchanged despite aggressive cross-examination. Other witnesses came forward, sailors who'd seen suspicious men boarding the ship, merchants who'd sold supplies to known criminals around the time of the attack, clerks who could verify the financial transactions. But Cedric's defense was equally well prepared. They brought character witnesses who testified to his gentle nature, his devotion to family, his moral uprightness. They presented medical experts who cast doubt on the reliability of traumatic memories. They suggested alternative explanations for every piece of evidence, creating a web of reasonable doubt. The trial stretched on for 2 weeks, each day bringing new revelations, new arguments, new reasons to hope or despair. Dorian testified again, enduring hours of brutal cross-examination designed to shake his story or expose inconsistencies. He held firm, refusing to be rattled. speaking his truth with unwavering conviction. Cedric's testimony was equally powerful. He wept on the stand, his grief and betrayal seemingly genuine. He spoke of loving his brother, of searching for him desperately after the attack, of the joy and confusion of his return. He denied every accusation with such passionate sincerity that even Dorian, who knew the truth, felt a moment of doubt. Finally, both sides rested. The lawyers made their closing arguments, the prosecution painting Cedric as a Cain figure, consumed by jealousy and willing to commit the ultimate betrayal, the defense portraying Dorian as a tragic figure so damaged by trauma that he'd created a false narrative to make sense of senseless tragedy. The jury retired to deliberate. The wait was agony. Hours passed with no word. Dorian paced the corridor outside the courtroom, unable to sit still, unable to think about anything but what was happening behind those closed doors. Marian stayed close, offering silent support, while Lord Thornvale maintained a stoic presence. Finally, as afternoon shadows lengthened, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled again, everyone eager to witness the conclusion of the drama that had gripped the county for months. The jury foreman stood, a prosperous-looking merchant with a grave expression. The judge asked for the verdict, and in the heavy silence, every breath seemed loud. "We find the defendant, Lord Cedric Ravensholt, guilty of attempted murder." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Cedric surged to his feet, screaming protests, claiming injustice. His lawyers immediately called for appeal. But through it all, Dorian sat frozen, barely able to process what he'd heard. Guilty. They'd believed him. Justice had prevailed. The judge gavelled for order, and when silence finally fell, he addressed Cedric directly. "Lord Cedric Ravensholt, you have been found guilty of one of the most heinous crimes imaginable, the attempted murder of your own brother. The sentence for such a crime is death by hanging. However, in light of your noble birth and the circumstantial nature of some evidence, I am prepared to offer an alternative." Everyone leaned forward, straining to hear. "You will be stripped of your title and property, such as they are. You will be transported to the penal colonies in Australia, there to serve a sentence of natural life with no possibility of return to England. You will leave these shores within a month, never to set foot on British soil again. This is my final judgment." Cedric's face contorted with rage and despair. He looked across the courtroom at Dorian, and in that moment, all pretense fell away. The hatred was naked and terrible. The jealousy that had driven him to attempt fratricide laid bare for all to see. "I should have made sure," he hissed, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. "I should have watched you drown, should have put a bullet in your skull to be certain. That was my mistake, thinking the ocean would finish what I started." The confession was spontaneous, born of rage and the realization that he'd lost everything. The courtroom erupted again, but this time with gasps of shock and horror. Cedric's own lawyers looked stricken, realizing their client had just sealed his fate beyond any hope of appeal. "Guards, remove the prisoner," the judge ordered, his voice heavy with disgust. "May God have mercy on your soul, Lord Cedric, for you'll find little mercy in the land where you're bound." As Cedric was dragged from the courtroom, still screaming his hatred and rage, Dorian felt something inside him finally break open, not with pain, but with release. It was over. The truth had won. Justice, however delayed, had been served. Marian was there immediately, her arms around him, and he held her as if she were the only solid thing in a spinning world. "It's over," he whispered. "God, Marian, it's finally over." "Not quite," she said, pulling back to look into his eyes. "We still have to figure out what comes next. How to rebuild, how to move forward, how to become who we're meant to be after everything that's happened." "Together," he said firmly. "We do it together." "Together," she agreed, and kissed him there in the courthouse, while snow fell past the windows and the world beyond continued its inexorable turning. The weeks that followed were a time of healing and reconstruction. Dorian formally assumed his duties as Duke of Winterbornne, working to undo the subtle damages Cedric had inflicted during his brief stewardship. He discovered debts his brother had hidden, alliances he'd forged with unsavory characters, small corruptions that needed to be rooted out and corrected. But he also discovered things that surprised him, charitable work Cedric had done quietly, improvements to tenant housing, fair settlements of disputes. It was a reminder that even in the depths of his jealousy and betrayal, Cedric had not been entirely evil. He had been human, complex, capable of both kindness and terrible cruelty. The complexity of it haunted Dorian. He'd wanted his brother to be a monster, simple and easily condemned. Instead, he'd been a man, flawed, jealous, consumed by resentment, but still human. It didn't excuse what Cedric had done, but it made the tragedy of it more profound. "Now you're brooding again," Marian said one evening, finding him in the library staring into the fire. "Thinking," he corrected. "About Cedric, about how it came to this. Could I have seen it? Could I have prevented it if I'd paid more attention to his feelings, his resentments?" "No," she said firmly. "You couldn't have prevented what he chose to do. He made his decisions, took his actions. The guilt is his, not yours. I know. Intellectually, I know. But I keep thinking about when we were boys, before the jealousy took root. We were close then, genuine friends. Where did it go wrong? Sometimes love curdles into something toxic, and there's no single moment when it happens. It's a gradual process, too slow to notice until it's too late." She settled beside him, taking his hand. "The question isn't why it happened. The question is where we go from here. Where do you want to go?" She smiled, the expression transforming her face. "Forward. Into a future neither of us expected but both of us deserve. Together." 3 months after the trial, on a spring morning when the gardens exploded with new growth and possibility, Dorian and Marian were married in the chapel at Winterbornne. It was a small ceremony, attended only by close friends and family, a deliberate choice after the public spectacle of the trial. They wanted this moment to be theirs, private and perfect, unmarred by scandal or speculation. As Dorian watched Marian walk down the aisle toward him, radiant in ivory silk, he felt the last pieces of his trauma beginning to heal. Cedric had tried to take everything from him, his life, his title, his future. But he'd failed. Dorian had survived, had fought back, had reclaimed what was his. And more than that, he'd gained something his brother never understood. The strength that comes from surviving betrayal, the wisdom that comes from confronting darkness, the love that endures despite every test. "I love you," he told Marian as they exchanged vows, and the words carried the weight of everything they'd endured together. "I love you," she replied, her voice steady and sure. "Through every storm, every trial, every challenge. Forever. Forever." It was a promise neither of them made lightly, not after everything they'd been through, but it was a promise they both intended to keep. The years that followed were good ones. Dorian proved to be an excellent duke, fair and just in his management of the estate, beloved by his tenants and respected by his peers. He never forgot the months he'd spent recovering in Portugal, the kindness of strangers who'd saved his life expecting nothing in return, and he used his position to help others wherever possible. Marian flourished beside him, using her position to champion causes she believed in: education for girls, fair treatment for servants, reforms to the harsh laws that governed the poor. Together they built something meaningful, a partnership that went beyond romance into genuine collaboration and mutual respect. They had children, 3 sons and 2 daughters, who grew up hearing stories of their father's courage, their uncle's betrayal, the triumph of justice over treachery. But Dorian and Marian were careful to tell these stories with nuance, to acknowledge complexity rather than painting simple heroes and villains. They wanted their children to understand that people were capable of both great good and terrible evil, sometimes within the same person. News of Cedric reached them occasionally over the years. He'd survived the transport to Australia, though the voyage had been brutal. He'd been assigned to a labor camp in the interior, where conditions were harsh and escape impossible. Some reports suggested he'd mellowed in exile, had found a kind of peace in accepting his punishment. Others painted a darker picture of a man consumed by bitterness, counting the days until death would release him from his living hell. Dorian didn't know which version was true, and ultimately he found he didn't care. Cedric had made his choices and lived with the consequences. Dorian's responsibility was to his own life, his own family, his own future. He couldn't afford to spend his days dwelling on what might have been, on the brother he'd lost twice, once to jealousy, once to justice. 20 years after the trial, a letter arrived from Australia. It was brief, written in a hand Dorian barely recognized as Cedric's, shaky with age or illness. "Brother, I am dying. The physicians say it's my lungs, weakened by years of hard labor in dusty conditions. I have perhaps weeks left, and I find myself thinking of home, of England, of you. I won't ask forgiveness. I don't deserve it, and I'm not sure I'd grant it if our positions were reversed. But I want you to know that I do have regrets. Not about being caught, not about the punishment, but about letting jealousy poison what we had. We could have been brothers in truth, not just in blood. That was my real crime, throwing away something precious for something worthless. I hope you've been happy. I hope the life you built was worth surviving for. I hope you've forgiven me, even if I can't forgive myself." Your brother, Cedric Dorian, read the letter 3 times, then shared it with Marion. They sat together in the library where so much had happened, where he'd confronted Cedric that first day after his return, where they'd planned strategy for the trial, where they'd celebrated victories and mourned losses. "Will you write back?" Marion asked. "I don't know." "What would I say?" "The truth. Whatever that is for you." He thought about it for days, composing and discarding a dozen different responses in his mind. Finally he wrote, "Cedric, I received your letter. I won't lie and say I forgive you completely. Some wounds go too deep for that. But I no longer hate you. Time and distance have given me perspective. You were my brother once, and that meant something, even if it wasn't enough to prevent what happened. I have been happy. Marion and I have built a good life, raised good children, done work we're proud of. You tried to take that from me, but you failed. And strangely, I think surviving your betrayal made me stronger, more appreciative of what I have, more determined to use my privileges wisely. I hope your end is peaceful. I hope you find whatever peace exists beyond this life. And I hope that somewhere in whatever comes after, the brother you were as a boy, the one I loved before jealousy twisted you, is waiting, free at last from the poison that destroyed you. Goodbye, Cedric." Dorian. He sent the letter knowing it might not arrive in time, that Cedric might die before reading it. But it didn't matter. The letter wasn't really for Cedric anyway. It was for Dorian himself, a final letting go of the rage and pain that had driven him for so long. News of Cedric's death reached him 2 months later. He'd passed quietly in his sleep, the letter from Dorian found clutched in his hand. Dorian mourned, not for the man Cedric had become, but for the brother he'd lost so many years before, for the potential that had been wasted, for the tragedy of a life consumed by envy. But he didn't let that mourning consume him. He had learned, through everything he'd endured, that dwelling in the past was its own kind of death. The only way to truly live was to move forward, to embrace the present, to build toward a future worth surviving for. On the anniversary of his return to Winterbornne, 21 years after he'd walked through those doors as a ghost returned to life, Dorian stood in the rose garden with Marion. They were older now, their hair touched with silver, their faces marked by time and experience. But they were together, and they were happy, and they had built something that would outlast them both. "Do you ever regret it?" Marion asked. "Pursuing justice, forcing everything into the light? We could have accepted Cedric's offer to disappear. We could have avoided the scandal, the pain, all of it." "Never," Dorian said without hesitation. "Truth matters, justice matters. If I'd let him walk away, I would have spent the rest of my life wondering if I'd done the right thing. This way, I know. I fought for what was right. And I won. Not just the trial, but the life that came after." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the estate that had seen so much drama, so much pain, so much triumph. The roses bloomed around them, their scent heavy on the evening air, and somewhere in the house behind them, they could hear their grandchildren laughing and playing. "Tell me again," Marion said softly. "Tell me about the moment you decided to survive." It was a story he'd told before, but she never tired of hearing it. "I was in the water," he began, the words familiar now, worn smooth by repetition. "Cold and dark, sinking deeper with every second. The weight of my clothes was dragging me down, and I could feel the life leaving my body. It would have been so easy to just let go, to stop fighting, to embrace the peace of surrender. But you didn't. But I didn't. Because I thought of you. I thought of your face, your laugh, the way you looked at me when you thought I wasn't watching. I thought about all the promises we'd made, all the dreams we'd shared, and I thought, no, I won't let him win. I won't let him take this from us. So I fought. I kicked toward the surface even though every muscle screamed in agony. I grabbed onto a piece of debris and held on even when my fingers went numb. I survived out of pure, stubborn refusal to let Cedric have the last word. "And thank God you did," Marion said, turning to face him. "Thank God you were too stubborn to die." He kissed her then, soft and lingering, a kiss that held 2 decades of love and survival and triumph. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. "Come on," she said, taking his hand. "Our grandchildren are waiting for their bedtime story, and you know how impatient young William gets when he's kept waiting." They walked back to the house together, hand in hand, their shadows stretching long across the lawn. Behind them the roses swayed in the evening breeze, and above them the first stars were beginning to emerge from the deepening blue of twilight. Inside, warmth and light and laughter waited. Their eldest daughter was there with her husband and 3 children. Their second son had arrived that afternoon from London with his wife. The family was gathering for the weekend, as they did several times a year, filling the halls of Winterbornne with noise and chaos and joy. Young William, all of 7 years old, came running the moment he saw them. "Grandfather, you promised to tell us about the pirates." "I promised to tell you a story before bed," Dorian corrected, scooping the boy up. "And it's hardly bedtime yet. But I want to hear about the pirates and the shipwreck and how you survived." Dorian exchanged a glance with Marion, who smiled and nodded. The story of the attack had become something of a family legend, told and retold with each generation. But they'd always been careful to tell it in age-appropriate ways, emphasizing the adventure and survival rather than the betrayal and violence. "Very well," Dorian said, settling into his favorite chair by the fire with William on his knee. The other grandchildren gathered around, and even the adults drew closer, pretending to be engaged in other conversations but clearly listening. "It was a dark night on the Atlantic," Dorian began, his voice taking on the storytelling cadence he'd perfected over the years. "The ship was called the Destiny, and she was bound for Portugal with a cargo of wool and dreams. I was aboard with my crew, watching the stars and thinking about coming home to your grandmother." "Was she beautiful?" William's sister Charlotte interrupted. She was 9 and deeply invested in romance. "The most beautiful woman in all of England," Dorian said, winking at Marion. "Still is." "Tell about the storm," William demanded. "There was no storm that night," Dorian said. "That's what made it so treacherous. The sea was calm, the wind was fair, and we thought we were safe. But sometimes the greatest dangers come when you least expect them. Men came aboard. Rough men, pirates, we thought, though the truth was more complicated than that. They wanted our cargo, our valuables, and they weren't interested in leaving witnesses." He edited carefully, leaving out the parts about Cedric's involvement, about the deliberate assassination attempt. The children knew Uncle Cedric had done something bad and had to go away forever, but they didn't need the full, dark truth. Not yet. Perhaps when they were older, when they could understand the complexity of jealousy and betrayal and the way good people could make terrible choices. "There was a fight," he continued, swords clashing, men shouting. "I fought as hard as I could, but there were too many of them. I was wounded and thrown overboard into the cold, dark water." The children gasped, even though they'd heard this part before. Charlotte clutched her doll tighter, and young William's eyes were wide as saucers. "I sank deep, so deep I could see the light from the ship growing smaller above me, and I thought, this is how it ends. This is where my story finishes. But then I thought of your grandmother, waiting for me back in England. I thought of all the things I still wanted to do, all the places I wanted to see, all the love I still wanted to share, and I decided that I wasn't ready to die." "So you swam!" William shouted. "So I swam. I kicked and pulled and fought my way back to the surface. My lungs were burning, my wounded side was screaming, but I didn't stop. I broke through the water and gasped in the sweetest air I'd ever tasted. The ship was gone, disappeared into the night, but there was debris floating around me, broken pieces of the hull, barrels, rope. I grabbed onto a piece of timber and held on for dear life. "How long were you in the water?" Charlotte asked. 2 days, Dorian said quietly. 2 days of drifting, of fighting to stay conscious, of watching the sun rise and set and rise again. I was delirious from blood loss and exposure. I saw things that weren't there, mermaids and sea monsters and angels. I talked to people who weren't with me. I was quite honestly dying. "But you didn't die," William said triumphantly. "But I didn't die," Dorian agreed, "because on the morning of the 3rd day, a fishing boat appeared. Portuguese fishermen, good men who pulled me from the water and probably saved my life. They took me to their village, and the women there nursed me back to health. It took months of fever and recovery and learning to walk again. But slowly, I got stronger. And when I was finally well enough, I made my way back to England, back to Winterbornne, back to your grandmother." "And you lived happily ever after," Charlotte said, satisfied with the ending. "We did," Dorian said, looking at Marion over the children's heads. "We do. And that's the most important part of the story, not the adventure or the danger or even the survival. It's what came after, the life we built together, the family we created, the love that endures through everything." The children wanted to hear more, wanted every detail repeated and embellished, but their parents intervened, declaring it was indeed bedtime. There were protests and negotiations, but eventually the grandchildren were herded off to their various rooms, leaving Dorian and Marion alone again in the library. "You tell it differently now," Marion observed. "Less darkness, more hope." "I see it differently now," Dorian admitted. "For years, all I could focus on was the betrayal, the pain, the injustice of it all. But time has given me perspective. Yes, Cedric tried to kill me. Yes, he stole a year of our lives with his lies. But he also failed. And in failing, he gave us something precious, the knowledge that our love could survive anything, that we were stronger than his jealousy, more resilient than his hatred. Do you think he ever understood that his betrayal ultimately made us stronger? I hope so. I hope that in those final years in Australia, he came to understand that you can't destroy love with violence, can't kill hope with treachery. Real love, the kind we have, survives because it's built on something deeper than circumstance or convenience. It's built on choice, on commitment, on the daily decision to choose each other despite everything. Marion moved to his side, and he wrapped an arm around her waist. 21 years, she said softly. 21 years since you walked back into my life like a ghost made flesh. Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago. It was a lifetime ago. We're different people now than we were then. Better people, I think. Definitely better. Tested and proven. Scarred but unbroken. He turned to face her fully. "I need you to know something, Marion. Need you to understand how grateful I am, not just for your love, but for your strength. You could have given up on me when I returned with wild accusations and demands for justice. You could have chosen the easier path, the path of denial and peace. But you didn't. You demanded truth. And then you stood by that truth even when it was difficult. You're the bravest person I know." "I'm not brave," she protested. "I was terrified through all of it. Terrified of losing you again. Terrified of what the truth might reveal. Terrified of the scandal and the pain. Being brave doesn't mean not being afraid. It means being afraid and doing what's right anyway. That's what you did. That's who you are." She kissed him then, and in that kiss was everything they'd survived, everything they'd built, everything they'd become. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. "Come to bed," she said. "Tomorrow's another day, and we have a house full of family to entertain." "Tomorrow," he agreed, but before they left the library he paused at the mantel, where a small painting hung. It showed 2 young boys, dark-haired and fair, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling at the artist with the uncomplicated joy of childhood. It was the only image of Cedric that Dorian had kept, a reminder of who his brother had been before jealousy poisoned him. "Do you think about him often?" Marion asked. following his gaze. Less and less as the years pass. But sometimes, yes. I think about the brother I lost, the boy in that painting who became a monster. I think about how thin the line is between love and hatred, between devotion and destruction, and I think about how lucky I am that I chose a different path. We both did, Marion said. We chose love over bitterness, forgiveness over vengeance, life over the grave. They climbed the stairs together, passing portraits of ancestors who had witnessed their own dramas and triumphs, who had faced their own tests and trials. The house was quiet now, the grandchildren settled, the adults retreating to their own rooms. Peace had descended over Winterborne, the kind of peace that comes from resolution, from justice served, from wounds that have finally healed. In their bedroom, familiar and comfortable after 2 decades of sharing it, Dorian and Marion prepared for bed with the easy intimacy of long marriage. They talked quietly about the next day's plans, about which grandchild needed what kind of attention, about the estate business that required addressing. But before they extinguished the lamp, Marion said, "Tell me one more thing. Tell me the absolute truth. If you could go back and change it, if you could prevent Cedric's jealousy, stop the attack before it happened, avoid all the pain and trauma and years of struggle, would you?" Dorian was quiet for a long moment, really considering the question. Finally he said, "No, I wouldn't change it, because changing it would mean changing us, changing who we became through surviving it. The man who went on that ship was naive, untested, taking his blessings for granted. The man who came back was forged in fire, grateful for every breath, aware of how precious and fragile life is. I'm a better Duke, a better husband, a better father and grandfather because of what I survived. So no, I wouldn't change it, even though it cost me a brother and nearly cost me my life." "I thought you'd say that," Marion said, settling against his shoulder, "because I feel the same way. The woman I was before you died was softer, more naive, less certain of her own strength. The woman I became through mourning you and then fighting for you, she's someone I'm proud to be." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, the moonlight streaming through the windows, the house quiet around them. And if Dorian dreamed of cold Atlantic waters or his brother's face twisted with jealousy, he didn't remember when morning came. The years continued to pass, bringing with them the usual mixture of joy and sorrow, triumph and challenge. Dorian and Marion's children grew and had children of their own. The estate prospered under careful management. New technologies changed the world around them, but Winterborne remained a constant, a touchstone of tradition and continuity. Dorian never fully forgot the betrayal, but it ceased to define him. He was known instead for his fairness, his wisdom, his dedication to improving the lives of those who depended on him. People spoke of the Duke of Winterbornne with respect and affection, and if they sometimes whispered about the scandal of his brother's conviction and transportation, it was with sympathy rather than condemnation. On his deathbed, many years later, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, Dorian looked back on his life with satisfaction. He'd survived an attempt on his life, had faced down his would-be killer in court, had rebuilt his reputation and estate. He'd loved deeply and been loved in return. He'd raised good children who were raising good children of their own. He'd made a difference in the world, however small. But more than any of that, he'd proven something fundamental. That love is stronger than hatred, that truth is more powerful than lies, that justice, however delayed, eventually prevails. Cedric had tried to take everything from him, but in the end, all the betrayal had accomplished was to prove how resilient the human spirit can be, how much can be survived with courage and love, and the simple refusal to give up. "Tell me the story one more time," he whispered to Marion, who sat beside his bed holding his hand. "Tell me about the girl who waited." "I waited for you," Marion said, tears streaming down her face, but her voice steady. "Everyone said you were dead, that I should move on, that mourning forever would destroy me. But I waited. Not because I knew you'd return, I didn't. I thought you were gone forever. I waited because love doesn't die just because the beloved does. I waited because what we had was real, and real things don't disappear just because they're taken from us. And when I came back? When you came back, I was angry and confused and frightened. But underneath all of that, I was grateful. Grateful that the universe had given us a second chance. Grateful that love had proven stronger than death. Grateful that waiting had been rewarded. Would you wait again, if you had to do it all over? Every time, she said without hesitation. For you, I would wait forever. Those were the last words Dorian heard before he slipped away, surrounded by love, having lived a full and meaningful life, despite everything that had tried to destroy him. He died as he had lived since his return, grateful for every moment, aware of every blessing, and deeply, completely loved. At his funeral, attended by hundreds of people whose lives he'd touched, the priest spoke of resilience and redemption, of justice and mercy, of the power of love to transform tragedy into triumph. But it was Marian who delivered the most important words, standing before the assembled mourners with the strength and grace that had carried her through decades of challenges. My husband was not a perfect man, she said. He was scarred, literally and figuratively, by betrayal and violence. He carried wounds that never fully healed, memories that haunted him until his final days. But he was a good man, a man who chose hope over despair, forgiveness over bitterness, life over death. He was a man who survived the unsurvivable and built something beautiful from the ruins of what was taken from him. She paused, looking out over the sea of faces. Dorian's story is not unique. All of us face betrayal in some form, experience loss, endure trauma. What made him extraordinary was not what happened to him, but how he responded. He could have been consumed by hatred for his brother, could have spent his life seeking revenge, could have let bitterness poison everything he touched. Instead, he chose differently. He chose to live fully, love deeply, and leave the world better than he found it. He taught our children and grandchildren that survival is not enough. You must also thrive, that justice matters, but so does mercy, that the past shapes us, but doesn't have to define us. These lessons, this legacy, will outlive all of us. And perhaps that's the greatest triumph of all, that the man who was meant to die young instead lived long and well, and touched so many lives with his wisdom and grace. She stepped down from the pulpit and placed a single red rose on the casket, a rose from the garden where they'd first kissed, where they'd reunited after a year of separation, where they'd built a life together from the ashes of betrayal. "Goodbye, my love," she whispered. "Wait for me. I'll find you again wherever you've gone. I always do." Years later, when Marian herself passed on, surrounded by the same love and family that had attended Dorian's death, she was buried beside him in the family plot at Winterbornne. Their matching headstones bore simple inscriptions: Dorian Ravensholt, Duke of Winterbornne, beloved husband, father, grandfather, he survived to thrive, Lady Marian Ravensholt, Duchess of Winterbornne, beloved wife, mother, grandmother. She waited, and love rewarded patience. Between the graves a rosebush was planted, descended from the very garden where their story had begun and nearly ended. Each spring it bloomed with remarkable vigor, covering both graves with scarlet blossoms that perfumed the air with the scent of love and remembrance. And if you stood in that graveyard at sunset, when the light turned golden and the shadows grew long, you might almost hear whispered voices carried on the wind, the sound of two souls reunited at last, their story complete, their love eternal, their legacy secure. The servants at Winterbornne sometimes spoke of seeing them there on quiet evenings, two figures walking hand in hand through the gardens, their forms translucent in the fading light, their faces young again and unmarked by time or trauma. Whether these sightings were real or simply the product of romantic imagination hardly mattered. What mattered was what they represented, the enduring truth that real love transcends even death, that courage and justice ultimately prevail, and that the greatest revenge against those who try to destroy us is to live fully, love deeply, and refuse to let their hatred diminish our light. Cedric Ravensholt died alone in Australia, his name forgotten by most, his crimes recorded but not dwelt upon. He left no legacy, no descendants, no mark upon the world beyond the cautionary tale of what jealousy can drive a man to do. In the end, his greatest punishment was not transportation or hard labor, but irrelevance, dying unmourned and unremembered, while the brother he'd tried to destroy lived on in the hearts and memories of everyone who knew him. The story of the two brothers became legend in the county, told and retold with each generation, Some versions emphasize the drama and betrayal, turning it into a Gothic tale of attempted fratricide and miraculous survival. Others focused on the love story, on Merian's patient waiting and Dorian's determined return. Still others made it a lesson about justice, about the importance of truth even when truth is difficult. But the truest version of the story was the simplest, that one man tried to take everything from his brother and failed, because some things cannot be stolen or destroyed. Love, honor, dignity, the will to survive, these are not possessions that can be taken by force. They are choices, made again and again, moment by moment, day by day. And Dorian chose them all, every single day of his long life, until he passed peacefully into whatever comes after, secure in the knowledge that he had lived well and loved deeply, and left the world better for his presence in it. And that, dear listeners, is perhaps the greatest triumph any of us can hope for. Not to live without challenge or pain or betrayal, but to face those trials with courage and emerge not broken, but transformed, not diminished, but expanded, not destroyed, but refined like gold in fire. Dear friends, thank you so much for joining us on this emotional journey through Dorian and Merian's story. If this tale of love, betrayal, survival, and ultimate triumph touched your heart, we would be so grateful if you could take just a moment to subscribe to our channel, Echoes of Romance. Your subscription helps us bring you more beautifully crafted stories of love and resilience. Please leave us a comment below telling us what you thought of Dorian and Merian's journey. Were you surprised by Cedric's betrayal? Did the trial scene have you on the edge of your seat? What was your favorite moment in their story? We absolutely love reading your thoughts and reactions, and if you enjoyed this tale, please give us a thumbs up. That little like button helps more romance lovers discover these stories. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you'll never miss when we release our next enchanting historical romance. Until next time, may your own love stories be filled with the same resilience, passion, and enduring devotion that defined Dorian and Merian's extraordinary lives. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next Echoes of Romance.